I think there is a suburb within a suburb. There is property markets within property markets. Australia is one of those real estate markets where there is more than 13,000 suburbs and there is more than 13,000 markets when you talk about property markets, right? And so when you hear people talk about Melbourne is going down, there are suburbs within Melbourne that are still doing amazingly well. When you see Perth going up, there are suburbs in Perth which are still going down, right? You see Adelaide doing well, and I spoke to a client yesterday where she said that she has bought a property in Adelaide, held it for 5 years, and that property has done nothing for them. And I was so surprised. I was like, wow, this is the best growth the Adelaide has ever seen in the last sort of 15 years. And so, how did you win so wrong? And again, it came back to the same thinking. And so, if you think about suburb selection, the first thing to understand is um, how do you define a growth suburb versus a growth corridor? A lot of people, when they think about property investing, they focus on what I call is the growth corridors, and media talks about it. Um, Agents talk about it, and there is a natural inclination for people to actually go into growth corridors because the land is cheap, or there is big developers. There is big posters. There is big fancy fun days that they organize. The land is settling in 2 years, 3 years, and so they make it a bit of a fun. They make it an event, and of course, people get attracted to it. And so there is a massive difference between a growth corridor and a growth suburb. And let's explore those differences first. I'm a big supporter of buying in growth suburbs rather than growth corridors, where people are focusing on off the plan properties or house and land packages. I am more focused, especially with this due diligence that we are talking about today, more focused on established property, where we are talking about land values, and we'll help them understand as to how to identify the price points and how to pick up a price point for particular suburbs as well. But let's explore growth corridors versus growth suburb. What do you think, Cheryl?
Yeah,
Growth corridor. What comes to your mind?
growth corridor. When I'm thinking growth corridor, often I'm thinking greenfield areas. So areas where they haven't been developed. So if you look at a map, they call it greenfield because it's all green, and there used to be pastures, farming, whatever that might be. And these are all the new land releases where you've got land lease stocklands, all these big developers that buy up, to 200 acres of land, and then they've got these beautiful new communities, which is amazing. Which is amazing. I mean, I think it's wonderful. But the truth is, the growth corridors, and they're going to have lots of new infrastructure and new activity going through it. However, because there's all this new product being released, it's going to take a while for property to generally increase in value because there's always so much competition. There's competition. It's
100%.
wonderful. I think it's wonderful for people who are looking for owner occupier, young families. It often caters to the affordability market as well. This is why I think affordability market, and you want new amenities and everything else, new schools and everything. I think it's really great for, like I said, families that want to live the owner occupier market as well. And so I
Definitely.
say growth corridors, fantastic if probably you're a developer that's looking to sell stuff. For someone that's looking to hold stuff, maybe we can talk a little bit more about the growth suburbs. Like, what's the difference with a growth suburb? Isn't a growth corridor suburb going to be a growth suburb?
And so that's a perfect segue from growth suburb to growth corridor to growth suburb. Now, what people don't realize is when they're thinking about property as an investment or as an asset, this asset performs like any normal asset. Higher demand, lower supply, prices go up, right? So this is macroeconomics 101 right there. The higher the demand, the lower the supply, the prices go up. The higher the supply, even the demand is high, but if the supply is even higher, like growth corridors, the demand never pushes the price pressure, never creates that price pressure for you to see that equity growth that you're looking for. And so, is it bad to buy in growth corridors at the start as a first home buy? No, I think it's perfect. Do you
Mm,
never see any growth in growth corridors? No, that's not true as well. You would see growth in growth corridors, of course, but what tends to happen is that slowly and gradually, as the demand supersedes the supply and the developers are exiting out of these growth corridors, what tends to happen is these corridors turns into growth suburbs. What I call it is that they reach their maturity. Okay, And so instead of you waiting for that transition to happen in, say, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, you can't predict how
Mm,
fast or slow the developer is going to go.
mm,
You would rather focus on areas where the suburbs have matured already and you can identify the demand and the supply quite safely. And that's where the growth suburb concept comes into place. Now,
yeah.
I use this analogy of ambulance. I've talked about ambulance in my previous podcast, but I'll use this analogy of a pressure cooker. And so this analogy for pressure cooker is basically you have a pressure cooker sitting on a stove. You put the veggies, you put the chicken. People who are non-veg, or vegetarian don't put chicken in there. You can put anything else. You put water in there, put the lid on, and you wait, right? And so you don't know what's happening inside. Okay, the steam builds up, the steam builds up, the steam builds up, and the first thing that you see is or you hear is that little whistle. Okay, and that's the real example of a growth suburb. Okay, so you hear that little whistle is basically an indication that, hey, the demand and supply is happening in the area. Supply catches up demand, demand catches up supply, supply disappears, demand starts growing, the pressure is building up. As the pressure is building up, you hear this little whistle, and that is the due diligence that we're going to talk about today. You hear this little whistle, and that little whistle is what you want to catch and buy in that suburb. As soon as you catch that little whistle, through the evidence-based investing, you go in and buy in those suburbs. What tends to happen majority of the times, and this is crazy, right? That people buy in the suburbs where the whistle is going bonkers. The whistle is just off the roof, and people are going in there because media is talking about it, buyers agents are talking about it. And so it's important to understand that when you're talking about growth suburbs, that suburb is doing nothing right now. On the face value, you would see nothing. Okay. And so you
Mm,
you go there and you'll be like, oh, okay, nothing is happening, nothing extraordinary. You would see a lot of maybe road work happening, for example. Okay. And so the real deal is when you go and attend auctions or when you speak to the real estate agents, then we'll talk about some of these indicators as to what some of these indicators are for growth suburbs as well. On
yeah.
top of the due diligence, how do you quickly identify what a growth suburb looks like?